Okay. Sorry, I had this going for a second and then it got cut off. So today, the the main topic that I'm going to be talking about, as as it was clearly stated in the introduction, is about Crete and the beginnings of Western civilization. This is a very huge, broad topic that I can't go over too well in a short video, but there are some basic things that I really want to talk about on this. In some later videos, I will probably be talking quite a bit about the Cretans, the Minoans on the island of Crete, and what they have contributed to us in our present day. I think a lot of people have kind of forgotten, or they don't pay a lot of attention to where many of the ideas we believe and what we understand actually come from. But not only that, but where a lot of cultural factors that go into art and religion, construction, buildings, and things actually came from. If you were to go and look into any Greek history book, every Greek history book always talks about the Minoans in Crete as the start of Greek civilization, even though if you look into the writings of the people on Crete, the original language of those people was not Greek. It is something they tend to call Minoan. It is also a language that is sometimes called Linear A because of the way in which the writing is done. They are pictographic, and Crete actually had originally some ideas about writing that they picked up from the Egyptians. That's why they call the early writings on Crete their kind of hieroglyphs, the pictographic hieroglyphs. But the first language to come out to be written down is what they call Linear A. Linear A is a language that has yet to be deciphered. It was found on pots and other little small discs and things where clearly what they have written down means something, but we cannot decipher it because we do not know that language. This would, the coming of the Mycenaean Greeks into that area would bring the Greek language with it, and that brought Linear B, which is another writing, which uses a lot of the same imagery as used in Linear A, except that the Linear A of the other people in the earlier language. But if you look at they discovered that Linear B is actually the earliest form of Greek, and therefore that they found a way that they can actually read Linear B. I actually have a book about Linear B that I picked up quite a while back because I thought it would be cool to kind of look at that along with my studies in ancient Greek language. But in this book, it also shows you a lot of the things that came with the cultural changes that were going on. When you look at the images here, these pictographs, the Greeks, the ancient Greeks on the island of Crete used Linear B to do all their writing. If you take those same images, apply the same alphabetical designations to the Linear A documents, you end up with a language that is not related to any other known language on the planet, which of course is not completely incomprehensible. The Minoans could easily have been speaking a language completely different from Greek, completely non-Indo-European. The Egyptians were not Indo-European. The Semites, the Semitic people of Syria, Babylon, the Levant, and other areas, of course, were not speaking any Indo-European language. But this language apparently does not look like it was related to those people either. It is something that originated there on the island of Crete. And then the imagery, the constructions, the the arts and everything that we find on Crete is something that is pretty unique to that particular civilization. I talked a little bit, of course, last time about how the eruption of the island of Thera, the island of Santorini, was possibly the cause of the destruction of the Minoan civilization that we know of, that we call it today. The history books that I have actually been going through have a slightly different take on it, and I could kind of see how they're doing it, but I think the basic of the demise of the Minoans was the eruption of Santorini. The people on Crete, after the eruption of Santorini, were able to go and rebuild several things, like some really interesting palaces that you could see on Crete today. But I believe that their own political structural organizations were really weakened by the collapse of things after the eruption, and therefore when the Mycenaean Greeks, who were the earliest Greeks to come into the area of the Greek peninsula and then coming onto the islands there in the sea, in the Aegean Sea, I think the Minoans were pretty much easy prey for them. Therefore, by about 1400 BC, you actually end up with the Linear B documents, which make it clear that there were people writing in the language of Greek at that time, and the influence of the Greeks in Crete only got stronger from there. Any of you who have read the Iliad know that there is reference to a prince from Crete named Idomeneus, I think is how you pronounce his name. I'll have to have some classicists to remind me how to pronounce his name, because I don't know if I've heard it spoken out loud in a long time. He actually joined the party of Agamemnon in the attack on Troy. So, and then what happens to him is a little bit sad, like it does most of the other heroes that took place in this attack on Troy. Their motives, of course, don't seem all that heroic. Granted, I commend a man who's going to retrieve his wife back from someone who's taken her away. But really, to have that lead to this huge war, that really would be interesting if that's true. Herodotus, the author himself, did not believe that that was the motivation behind it. That might have been the excuse given, but because the other wives and women have been kidnapped from other people for who knows how long. But anyway, going back to Crete, one of the things that really stands out, of course, besides the writing on Crete, is if you see a lot of the pictographs and a lot of the pottery that they have there on Crete, you're going to see that there's a lot of references to people who are there's a lot of things doing with bulls, like bull leaping. People seem to be jumping onto bulls and grabbing them by the horns and jumping over them, which is kind of dangerous as we understand it, certainly, but maybe they were really doing that. Bull leaping is what they were calling it. And there are quite a few other things that the way the old palaces, like the image that I have, the thumbnail on here, that shows you one of the old palaces. I think that is one of the later palaces that came after the collapse from the volcanic eruption. And so right here, this island of Crete that sits right there at the it's kind of at a crossroads, you could say. It sits there right where you have the other Greek islands leading up to mainland Greece. Then you have from Crete down to Egypt, or over to Cyprus and over to the Eastern Mediterranean, leading to the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. Crete really sat there and was a major jumping off point with trade and other kind of cultural things. And that is why the Minoan culture spread out off of Crete to these other islands around there. And of course, parts of the mainland Greece, of course, received a good deal of it before the Mycenaeans came in. And I think a lot of the things that the Greeks actually obtained from the Cretans, the people from the Minoans, is really substantial as well. When the Greek ancestors first arrived, of course, they did not have the culturally significant elements that we attribute to them today. Granted, most of the ancient Greek philosophers who first started writing things down were in what we call modern day Turkey. And then when it comes down to the Iberian Peninsula, into the southern part there in Greece, you are going to be seeing where much of the cultural changes, the cultural evolution that takes place there is due to their interaction with the Minoans and their influences down there in southern Greece. And some people think that also a lot of the Greek pantheons and gods are actually of Cretan origin, and therefore what you see and understand as Greek mythology, Greek gods, religion, much of those things like the god Poseidon or Apollo and a few others are possibly of Cretan origin. Zeus, when he was fleeing from his father and hiding from him before he was going to come back and take the throne, was said to be hiding on Crete, biding his time for when he could come back and, I guess, cut his father open and release his siblings that Kronos had swallowed. If you do not know the story about the stone that Kronos swallowed because he thought it was Zeus, and Kronos was swallowing his children because he knew that one of his children, if he was to have children, would come back and dethrone him, and Zeus would be the one who dethroned him. That is a really interesting bit of mythology there in Greek culture. And when I talk a little bit more about Greek as opposed to Cretan Minoan civilization, I will be talking something about that. I'll just have to point out here, of course, that I've always found the idea of Greek civilization probably one of the things that is of most interest to me. The very first history book that I picked up willingly and to start reading it, and I think this was near the end of my high school years, is I really was only reading history books that were being handed to me. Sometimes I could find them interesting and sometimes I wouldn't. But the first one that I picked up willingly and read from beginning to end is this book here. And no, I didn't steal this from the library. This history book is A History of Greece. Now, this is the 4th edition. I think the one that I picked up from the library was the 3rd edition. I actually like the way the cover looks on that 3rd edition better than this one, but I wanted the book. I didn't care too much about what the cover looked like at the time. And with this picking up of this book, it talks at the very beginning of Greek civilization, history of Greece. We have to start on the island of Crete. On the island of Crete, you have all of these elements that are able to create a civilization that is really, really rich and strong. You have a lot of places where mining can take place. You have a lot of areas where farming can take place. You have seafaring. Like I said, there's seafaring going on all around there because of its location. There are islands in almost every direction that they can go and spread out from there. They do fishing. I might consider reading some of the things out of here that was really significant. Give me a second here and I'll decide which one I want to read to you. But a lot of the pottery that shows up on Crete also shows up in areas on mainland Greece, which makes it clear that the Minoans were a strong element there that really started everything. So you cannot start a history of Greece without knowing about the people who existed on the island of Crete and a lot of the kinds of writings that were going on there. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that back before quite a few other areas, the Greeks were actually doing writing of their own in what we call Linear B. And it's kind of sad that when you see these Dark Age take over in the area of Greece after the Dorian invasion, writing completely disappears until around the time of Homer, when you see the poetry there being written down by Homer and by others. The other poet completely slips my mind. I hope people can forgive me about that one. He was a Theban poet who wrote largely agricultural type things, but he will be discussed, of course, when I get around to talking more about Greek civilization rather than the Cretan civilization. So here, when we look at some things, when we talk about Crete, the earliest times in Crete are with the it talks about this around the third millennium BC, and then it sort of builds up over time until around the time of 1900 BC. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to read all of this. This is way too much. To 1900 BC, when we first start to see the actual physical emblems, the evidence of culture there on that particular island. A lot of the things, of course, that are going to be seen in this particular culture, the most famous things are those palaces themselves that would eventually dominate the island. And one of the things that this history book does say is that the beginnings of the palaces here was showing evidence of a strong central organized government that really brought a lot of these things together, where they start to actually form a single unit. That would explain why there is a single ruler coming from Crete joining the expedition to Troy. But then again, Edominus himself, I think, was Greek, and so that was a later person. That was not someone who was of Minoan origin. But the idea of a united Crete was pretty much something that they had understood from the earliest times. And when around 1900, around 1900 is when the strong cultural elements find themselves there on Crete. After the eruption of Santorini, there seems to be they indicate that there's some united understanding organization there on the island of Crete because of all of these palaces that were built. And these palaces were built within they have a common organizational element to them, building structure and everything. And so they believe that that is the start, of course, of how we get the start of how we get the structures that we see them there. However, other evidence that comes later actually indicates that while a lot of the structures and things are the same, there was actual evidence that these people might not have been a single organized cultural unit. Cultural unit, but not a political unit. And so anyways, that's the basics things that I'm going to be talking about here. So that's pretty much where I'm going to end here as it relates to this particular subject. As I said at the very beginning, This is a huge subject, and at a later time, I will be talking a little bit more about the Minoans and their contributions to Western civilization. But anyway, I hope everybody has a great day, and this is having a great Friday here today. And till next time, I bid thee adieu, and we will be talking a little bit more probably about more Western culture, but some other things will probably present themselves. But I will be talking about Crete and Greece again at a certain time. I just completely get drawn into a lot of the rather interesting little findings that people are finding here lately about other topics. So hope everyone's got a great Friday. Until next time, I bid thee adieu.